India, as it is legally defined in British law, is an entity that's almost 2.5 times bigger than the Indian nation state today. The story that I tell in the book, essentially, is how this one Indian Empire passport becomes, by the 1970s, 12 independent passports.
My idea was what I would see in the Gandhi movie. But there's a lot which we don't know about, which was the fact that there were these princely states. A lot of them were very wealthy. There were lots of sophistication, lots of universities, lots of cultural intermingling.
A place like Hyderabad Hyderabad state was larger than modern France, had an economy that rivaled Belgium's, and was ruled over by the richest man in the world. We forget that the land that is now Bangladesh was actually the center of the Pakistan movement.
What happens with his love story, and how does that set in motion who Jinnah becomes and ultimately what happens to him?
When Ruti has this overdose, Jinnah goes to look after her in hospital, and Gandhi and his acolyte Nehru use the opportunity to basically get Jinnah's bill removed. Now it's not a question of kind of will India become independent, but when will it, and how many Indias will there be?
May wanted to turn the AC down, completely off, because of the noise, and I've told her, May, please do not do that. But if this thing starts making noise, then we may have to do it. Sure. Okay. But okay, May, you ready? 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Kareem, and I'm thrilled, really thrilled today to welcome to our studio Sam Dalrymple. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a beautiful, beautiful day to be here.
Sam's just walked over from about 30 minutes, and it's about 34 degrees outside, so it's a beautiful day, as he says. Sam, you've written a book called Shattering Lands. And it's about how what you call in the book and has been called in various historical archives, not all archives, the Indian Empire was shattered into 12 nation states through 5 partitions. I've read parts of the book, and I think you could call it shattering minds, because it shattered my mind in a way. It was really paradigm changing. When I walked in here to May sitting here behind the camera, and I was like, May, you should strap in because we're speaking to Sam, and this is going to be a fantastic conversation. It's going to be really riveting because there's so much in the book which is new to me, which I think will be new to most people. So many different tales. I want to start off, right, because you assert and you back it up with loads of evidence, loads of stories, loads of documents, loads of everything else. Things that are hard for the mind to imagine. The idea that the Indian Empire stretched from, and we'll show this map to our audience properly, through Oman, parts of Kuwait, all the way to what is now Myanmar, Burma. And people still think of India, they think of it, mainly the biggest part of India is, India with Pakistan and Bangladesh, maybe Sri Lanka part of it, right? And you assert that there was this much bigger India. It's hard to imagine that, there were princely states in the Gulf, which were subservient in a way to part of an Indian empire, where Arabs in the Gulf were second-class citizens to Indians. Not necessarily that way, but fundamentally, yes, right? Tell me why I should believe and why the audience should believe that this is the case, that there was this vast Indian empire. How did this empire work? Was it Indian empire, or is that a created notion because it's actually just what the British Raj was controlling? Like, what is this thing called the Indian Empire?
Sure. So the Indian Empire was a completely constructed thing. Basically, when the Brits in the 1920s, after World War I, released the first Indian passport, India, as it is legally defined in British law, is an entity that's almost 2.5 times bigger than the Indian nation state today, stretching from what is now the city of Aden in southern Yemen, as far east as Burma and the borders of Thailand, basically containing a quarter of the world's population in a single unit. This was never, this was, even at the time, not considered to be sort of one thing. It was considered an empire within an empire. So India, according to the Interpretation Act, which was written in the 1880s, was legally defined as all places subservient to the viceroy and under the Indian political or civil service. And that include not just directly ruled British India, which was an entity centered on Kolkata, and the big cities, of course, were Bombay, Madras, Kolkata, and Delhi. But also included princely states and protectorates. So many people who've been to India and Pakistan know that about a third of the Raj was never directly ruled by the British. They were ruled by semi-independent princes, Nawabs, Maharajas, the Maharajas of Kashmir, or the Nizam of Hyderabad, or the Khan of Kalat, these semi-independent princes, whom roughly kind of internally ruled their kingdoms, but handed over their foreign policy and their defense, etc., to the Viceroy of India. What we forget is if you look at alphabetically the list of princely states issued by the Raj, it opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi and goes on to list other such states such as Bhutan and Qatar. And so I think that we've forgotten the sheer scale of what sort of, the British Indian administrative empire essentially was. And the story that I tell in the book is how in 5 decades between the 1920s and the 1970s, this one Indian empire passport that is issued in places like Yemen. There is this passport that's now in a museum in Tel Aviv. It was issued to a Yemeni Jewish woman who wanted to migrate to Jerusalem after the Balfour Declaration. Now, she has never been to places like Bombay, but in order to make that migration, she has to get an Indian passport because by virtue of being born in southern Yemen, she is legally an Indian subject and thus needs to travel on that passport. Of course, people across this Indian empire had many different national identities, and I think we struggle to remember a time when a time essentially before nationalism. So, there were, of course, ideas of sort of pan-Indian nationalism. Interestingly, some of the earliest Yemeni nationalists and Burmese nationalists began as Indian national congressmen. But you also had fledgling Burmese nationalism, Yemeni nationalism, Arab nationalism, Dravidian nationalism, Kashmiri nationalism, Sikh nationalism, Hindu nationalism, Muslim nationalism. There were so many different directions, different visions for what the world could have looked like after empire, but it wasn't necessarily the one that we ended up with. And the story that I tell in the book, essentially, is how this one Indian empire passport becomes, by the 1970s, 12 independent passports. How one Indian empire becomes 12 nation states, and how, in understanding the Raj's fragmentation, in understanding the multiple ruptures which carved their way through the subcontinent, we can understand not just the conflicts in Kashmir, the conflict between India and Pakistan, but also everything from the Rohingya genocide, civil war in Yemen, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in the first Gulf War, in separatist movements in Balochistan and northeast India. All of these have their roots ultimately in one of these 5 separate ruptures, most of which I think have largely been forgotten.
Okay, now I mean, it's not just the wars and the conflicts. You can understand haleem and harees, which are foods in large parts of India, and harees in Qatar, for example. Through it, karak chai is an example of these things as well. And we'll get into all of this. I mean, there's 2 things I want you to just. It's not the 2 things we discussed before the interview that I said we may discuss. It's just in response to what you just said, right? How much of this you see because there's now these 12 nation states, and there's some of the oldest among them goes back to the 1930s, and the vast majority of its citizens go back to 1947 with the rupture of India and Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh, right? But in the modern education system, people have been educated in these countries, in the rest of the world, without this history being revealed for various reasons, for nationalism, for national curriculums, etc. And so this will be a lot, I mean, before we go into the much more recent revelations that have been released through declassified documents, this will be a new idea, right? And based on what you've just answered, people will listen to this and say, yeah, but maybe this was a British imposed idea of this Indian empire. Like, how did local feels about this? Did they feel part of some sort of what was called it's hard to imagine a Yemeni in the 1800s or in the year 1806, fishing, thinking of himself as a subject of some Indian empire, and I don't think he did, right? So how did the locals feel about what was this British idea of an Indian empire?
Well, I think that the same applies across the Indian empire. Most people living in rural villages very rarely actually, conceived of themselves as part of a nation in the early 20th century. They conceived of themselves as part of a village, maybe part of a religious community, maybe part of a kind of regional community. In the big cities, you had these kind of growing senses of being part of a similar world. And what I find is fascinating so if you were growing up if you were a pearl diver in Qatar, I don't think that you would have necessarily considered yourself Indian. You would probably been considered yourself Khaliji. Many of there are all sorts of links, though, and unexpected legacies. What's interesting is cities like Aden, which was the biggest city in the Arabian Peninsula at the time, what's now southern Yemen. Aden really did have this thriving sort of discussion on whether they could be considered whether they could be considered Indian, and whether Arab could become an Indian ethnicity alongside Bengali and Punjabi and and Telugu and Tamil. There were all these debates about who constitutes India and what constitutes India, essentially. And there's this big debate in the 1930s that we've largely forgotten about, where on the one hand, people like Mahatma Gandhi say that the ancient epics, this idea of Bharatvarsh that was laid out in the Mahabharata and the ancient Indian epics, should form the basis of a future Indian nation tied together by a sacred geography. But on the other hand, there are all sorts of people who say that we should basically remove the British, but then keep this area united as this kind of huge superpower, essentially. And so some of Burma's earliest politicians are arguing against separation from India and are imagining a future where Burma is a constituent part of India. And these are stories that I think we've forgotten. It's also fascinating. We were talking about pearl divers wouldn't have necessarily thought of themselves, but if you were linked with the political administration anyway, indeed many of the princely families, the Sultans of Oman, for example, were educated for generations at Mayo College, Ajmer in Rajasthan, such that they became more fluent in Urdu than they were in Arabic. And so the Urdu remained the language of Oman's army for several more decades into the 20th century. Much of what's now eastern Yemen, Hadramaut, was ruled for half the year from the city of Hyderabad in the Deccan, because of the fact, so you can actually go in Hyderabad to the area of Medipatnam and see the old Yemeni palace where the Al-Qaedi family basically rules over Hadramaut from the Deccan. And you mentioned haleem earlier. Haleem, this great culinary masterpiece, has its origins in this Yemeni family moving to the Deccan and essentially mixing sort of Arabian harees with Deccani spices and kind of creating this new culinary masterpiece. So I think that these links are still so obviously there, and you can see it in the populations that exist in these cities. There's still a large Yemeni community in Hyderabad. There's still, large Deccani communities in the Gulf. But we've forgotten this history. We've allowed ourselves to project modern national identity backwards, which I think obscures the many connections that tie us all together.
Okay. One more question, which is just sort of context setting before we go into the partitions and some of the characters and some of the key anecdotes in the book. Just imagine it's like the year 1900, right? Try to explain to the audience and to me what this region, which is now then called Indian Empire by the British administration, is like, right? There's 565 princely states. Mm-hmm. The biggest things like Hyderabad, the Nizam of Hyderabad, which is, he was richer than the King of Belgium. Yeah. We can go into that a bit. And then there's much more smaller states, right? But in terms of when I was growing up and, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, if you told me what was India or that subcontinent like in the year 1900, my idea was what I would see in the Gandhi movie, right? So a lot of impoverished villages, all suffering from British colonialism. Large parts of that is true, right? Hunger, famines, the extra, lots of wealth being taken out into empire. But there's a lot which we don't know about, right? The fact that there were these princely states, a lot of them were very wealthy. There were lots of sophistication, lots of universities, lots of cultural intermingling, cosmopolitanism. Tell me a bit about just, you have already, but just a bit more about what it was like to be a subject, in this vast swath of earth, which was the Indian Empire within the British Empire.
Yeah, so this vast Indian Empire, as I mentioned before, it essentially had directly ruled areas with very large British presences, and areas where there was virtually no British presence at all, and these princely states which were sort of semi-autonomous, and essentially preserved a lot of these pre-colonial political entities right into the middle of the 20th century. So, these old feudal courts often with sort of aristocrats lording over over hugely sophisticated courts full of music and dance. Also, a lot of political thought. I think that there is this image that has often been put that the princely states were essentially the kind of close allies of the Brits, and I think that Manu Pillai's book *False Allies* has discussed the way that many of these maharajas were often very important rebels against the Raj, fomenting, educating young revolutionaries and being places where a lot of dissent fermented. At the same time, many of these places were incredibly feudal and had very, very poor sort of non-aristocratic populations. India itself was, I think, a place that was industrializing massively fast. Thanks to things were hugely changing. You had the kind of, the steelworks going up in Jamshedpur. You had, some of the world's most global populations in places like Kolkata or Karachi. And I think in 1933, for example, Rangoon, I think we've forgotten Burma's central place in the 20th century. Rangoon in 1933 overtakes New York City as the largest emigration port in the world. So there's so much money being made in a city like Rangoon that, thanks to the events of the 20th century, completely falls off the map. But it was, I guess, Singapore back in the day. And there's so much money to be made there that is, in a sense, preserved in songs like Mera Piya Ge Rangoon. My husband's gone to Rangoon. The reason that the husband has always gone to Rangoon was because that was the city where everyone was going to make their money. There are the princely states themselves, I think, range dramatically. So in a place like Gujarat, many of them are essentially just feudal estates. But a place like Hyderabad is Hyderabad state, which included all of modern Telangana and half of modern Maharashtra and Karnataka, was larger than modern France, had an economy that rivaled Belgium's, and was ruled over by the richest man in the world, who gained that title after the death of J.D. Rockefeller. So I think that this was a hugely diverse world. The world that you see in the Gandhi movie is very much there, but it coexists with this sort of rapidly changing world, which, and I think that sort of world you can see in the subcontinent today, the huge distinctions that exist between just, places that are just a few kilometers apart.
Okay. We're gonna soon jump into the 5 partitions, and I think that will bring to a fore a lot of what you said about the fact that understanding the conflicts today, understanding the conflicts and the identities and how they've been formed. These partitions are a great sort of way to understand it and to see how they. But before we go there, just to give again the viewers or listeners an idea of how this book changes paradigms, right? In the first chapter, you discuss Jinnah, right? Who I understand, and I like to consider myself quite well-read, right? Not like super well-read, not scholarly, but quite well-read. I know he's the founder of Pakistan. I know that his past isn't as romanticized as the average Pakistani probably makes it out to be. I know that what I knew before reading parts of your book was that he was part of the Congress Party. He was once pushing for United India, a form of United India, before actually pushing for partition. I knew these kind of things, but there's a lot which I didn't know about, which you told me about, right? And I think maybe a way for you to answer that is tell me how he falling in love and what happens with that kind of changes who he is as a person and also changes his political ideas, not exclusively him falling in love, but because it's also, the macro historical events that are occurring also change that, and the other individuals he encounters. But, what happens with his love story and how does that set in motion who Jinnah becomes and ultimately what happens to him?
I'm so glad that you asked this, because I think of all of the bits of the book, Jinnah was the one who most surprised me, because there are two very different Jinnahs, or maybe even three.
Before you continue, like Pakistanis are going to get very upset, so just stay there and just suppress your feelings because it's going to be interesting.
There are three very different Jinnahs that exist in South Asia in people's minds. There is the kind of scheming Jinnah of the Indian nationalist imagination, who is sort of, threatening to break India and is this kind of Muslim nationalist who wants to tear the nation apart. There is in Pakistan the founder of the nation, this sort of this bold man who's wearing a curricle hat and a kind of an achkan and this very sort of pious man who helps lead Pakistan into its sort of glorious independence. And then there is the Bangladeshi Jinnah, who essentially is a man who brings people close to this sort of moment of salvation and then betrays Bangladeshis at the last minute by trying to assert Urdu over all other languages. What I think is most fascinating is the fact that he is essentially none of these figures. He is a man who undergoes a larger political change than anyone else I found in the book. So when you first encounter Jinnah in the book, it's in the early 1900s. He is the leading Indian nationalist in a way that we've completely forgotten, and has been given a trophy by Sarojini Naidu, the leading female nationalist in the Congress, saying that he's that he is the kind of main source of Hindu-Muslim unity in the subcontinent. He is this kind of young lawyer driving around Bombay in a fast open-top car, and smoking cigarettes, drinking whiskey, and some people even say one of his favorite bits of food was pork sandwiches back in the day. So this very kind of this not particularly religious man, although he kind of felt that his Muslim identity was personally very important, but he barely went to the mosque. He was far more often seen in the jazz clubs of Bombay, right? And then he has this interfaith marriage. He falls in love with this young Parsi girl, much younger than him, called Ruti. And Ruti, and I think that this is when he begins to change, because he sees through his relationship.
He's 42 and she's 18.
She's right? 18, and he and her have this kind of this. She basically kind of runs away with him. And they get taken to court by her father, who says that kind of, Jinnah's run away with his daughter, and Ruti says to the court kind of, he has not run away with me, I have run away with him. But she's basically excommunicated by the Parsi community. And I think that Jinnah begins to write these letters about worrying whether India can ever move past religious divisions, whether many communities really can ever gel into one community. And then the story becomes completely tragic. Jinnah is a complete workaholic, continually forgets her birthday and things like this. They have a young daughter who remains unnamed for the first 4 years of her life because he's always away at work, and Ruti becomes a depressive. And the key event, I think, happens in Jinnah's career when his wife has a drug overdose. And he is currently fighting a battle for kind of basically Muslim reservations in a future Indian parliament. And when his star has been slightly waning. There's this new upstart who's returned from South Africa called Gandhi, who's begun to displace his popularity. And Jinnah, as far as he's concerned, Gandhi is this kind of, diaspora kid coming back from abroad and suddenly lecturing everyone on what sort of Indian culture really is, and Jinnah feels that he's completely out of touch with the realities of how India works. Now, when Ruti has this overdose, Jinnah goes to look after her in hospital, and Gandhi and his acolyte Nehru use the opportunity to basically get Jinnah's bill removed, so that basically slashing the number of Muslim reservations in Parliament.
So just explain what that is, the Muslim reservations in Parliament, yeah.
So India is still basically kind of ruled from the top imperially, but Britain is beginning to think about devolving power. to basically creating some sort of parliament where there can be Indian politicians helping to kind of represent and essentially establishing a House of Commons, like we have in the UK. There is a problem in India in that the Muslim population of India at the time is larger than the Muslim population of the entire Arab world. It's this enormous sort of enormously globally important Muslim population in one sort of British colony, essentially. But they are spread thin. So in most districts, Muslims constitute about 30 to 40% of the population. And so despite being this enormous population, in a democratic system, they are very rarely likely to win a vote. And so, if you were to give a completely free and fair election, Muslims continually basically lost. And so Jinnah is pushing for basically kind of reserved seats in parliament so that there will always be some sort of Muslim representation. But when he goes to look after his wife in hospital, his political rivals use the opportunity to basically slash those reservations. And I think Jinnah never really forgives Gandhi or Nehru about that. And I think that we forget how polarizing a figure Gandhi was at the beginning. I think when we read the history of partition in our textbooks, we tend to look at the 1940s. And in the 1940s, Jinnah is demanding a Muslim state, and Gandhi is preaching Hindu-Muslim unity and leading peace marches to try and stop and calm the violence of partition, as you saw in the Gandhi movie. But I think we forget how much they kind of do this in the course of the 1920s. How much the Jinnah of the 1940s is not the same as the Jinnah of the 1920s. And so Jinnah becomes very, very disillusioned after this, but still remains a workaholic. And eventually he and his wife separate. And then one day he finds basically her suicide note. And again, this was covered up for years, and this isn't part of the normal narrative of Jinnah. But I think everyone listening to this, as well as reading Shadowlands, should go to Sheila Reddy's book, Mr. and Mrs. Jinnah, which found all of her papers and found all of the letters about their relationship. And there is this tragic last sort of suicide letter from Ruti saying, I love you, my darling. And if I had loved you more, I would have stayed with you. Please remember me as the flower you picked and not the flower you tread on. And I love you, my darling. And it's this kind of absolutely emotional letter which completely breaks Jinnah. And so he then leaves the subcontinent, goes back to the UK. And I think returns a much harder man and a much more, a much angrier man in a sense. And in the coming years, he will begin pushing more and more for basically kind of better controls on how to reserve sort of Muslim seats in parliament. Eventually he will start demanding that that there needs to be, a Muslim states. At the Lahore Resolution, when he makes that announcement, though, I think it's rather fascinating how he never asks for a separate nation state. And a lot of new work on Jinnah suggests that actually the imagination that he had of his early Pakistan might have been more like Scotland within the UK, or kind of a state within a wider, still
autonomous region. Yep.
An autonomous region. He never says separate nation state. He says separate states that are guaranteed to always basically be Muslim majority, carved out. So and again, he's a constitutional lawyer who's worked in the UK. And I think it's fascinating how late he comes to actually demanding a separate country.
Okay, fascinating and very interesting. And I mean, there's from what I read, everything you've said is again, there's in the book. There's a lot more that's there, right? I think, before we even move on to the next anecdote, before we start the partitions, right? Just to build on what you're saying, and you probably would have covered this in the future anyway, like in what we're about to discuss. But you mentioned that they kind of go like this, right? And it's true. And Gandhi, that's known around the world, that's portrayed in the movie. He's seen as this unifying figure. When he arrives in India, his ideas are quite different, which was I found not entirely surprising, but it was interesting, if not completely surprising.
Jinnah leaves the Congress
Yes.
because of the fact that he thinks that Gandhi's bringing religion into politics.
Exactly, right? So, I mean, you've said it perfectly. So Gandhi kind of makes the entire thing, he makes the politics religious. In the same token, at the time, the Burmese, which we will speak about, do not want to actually be independent. They want to be part of a greater India. And Gandhi imagines this India, which is Bharat India, the India in the Mahabharata. And it becomes, eventually his vision comes to fruition. And that's how you have a society which is pretty polarized, and what we have now is what we'll get to in the future, in terms of India, and it's going increasingly more right wing with a RSS inspired BJP. The other thing which I want to discuss in your book before we start the partitions, and it's the last thing, and then we'll start the partitions, is at the end, right in the last chapter of your book, you speak about how you started a virtual library. Along with a few colleagues and you put it on social media so that people who are separated by the partition, very much like people have Nakba stories, people have partition stories of India and Pakistan, and so you wanted to create this virtual library where people can figure this out. And you meet I can't remember if it's a colleague or a friend, but you go along with him to his site of partition. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so this is my friend Sparsh, who I'm actually having dinner with tonight. So Project Dastaan emerged out of a conversation in college, when we were all undergrads, between Sparsh and our friend Amina. There was this kind of strange conversation. Firstly, how weird it was that here in the UK, unlike the subcontinent, we can have Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Brits all sitting in the same room, which is tragically not possible today in India or Pakistan. Maybe Bangladesh sometimes. But I think even more than that, there was this strange realization between Sparsh and Amina that their families had made perfectly opposite journeys during the partition. So the partition was the partition of 1947 was the largest forced migration in human history. Between 10 to 15 million people are displaced from their homes in the course of basically a year and a half. And basically none of them have ever been able to go home again. Unlike Bangladesh, which occasionally is friends with India and occasionally friends with Pakistan, and so people have occasionally been able to go home. India and Pakistan still have basically no tourism visa. There's no ability to trace down your ancestral roots between them. There's no right to return, nothing like it. And so, Sparsh's family had always spoken about this kind of their ancestral village of Bela, sort of in Punjab, but near the border of the northwest frontier, which was not too far from Jhang, where they lived for centuries. And they'd always talked about it as a town that was lost. And it was a strange realization whilst he was chatting to Amina that actually, it was a 2-hour drive from Islamabad, and she could visit it tomorrow if she wanted to. And she kind of had the similar realization at the same time that her ancestral town of Hoshiarpur, in what's now sort of Indian Punjab, was equally very, very easy for Sparsh to visit. And so in the course of this conversation, Sparsh came up with this idea of using virtual reality to reconnect partition families with their ancestral homes across the border. And I came in very, very soon after this, and together we built a team to basically interview partition families about the places that they'd left behind, the old friends that they wanted to see again, maybe the sweet shop where they used to go to buy sweets, the old mandir or masjid or gurudwara or house, or where their best friends used to live, anywhere that remains important in their mind. And we would send out volunteers to basically film it and edit together a little sort of virtual reality video to send back across the border so that these sort of 85-year-olds or 90-year-olds can put on a headset and walk through their village again. And the idea was to try and do 75 of these before the 75th anniversary, 2022, and try to use these stories to create conversation about partition, to educate people on all sides of the border, and here, particularly here in the UK, where there is such amnesia about partition, about Britain's role in partition. And so, yeah, we spent several years doing this. It turned into a very successful project that still occasionally tours the world and also has permanent homes in both Lahore and Amritsar, which is very, very nice. And occasionally there's little sort of screenings of these of the surrounding films as well here in the UK.
Okay, no, I mean specifically, I meant when what actually occurred when he goes back to, I think it's the village or something of that sort. Yeah.
So we were sparing Sparsha's own story for last because it was that the story of his grandfather was the one that I guess had inspired the whole project. When he hadn't applied for his visa, because he was scared that it would be rejected and that would sort of make him lose faith in the whole project. But eventually he got his visa. We now by this point had working partners on both sides of the border, and we were able to get the right letters of recommendation, etc. And we headed off to this small town of Bila. Sparsh put on this. So the story of Sparsh's grandfather was that they had lived in this village for years and never had any problem. One day, a mob arrived and basically went from somewhere else. It wasn't from their village, but started murdering all of the Hindus and Sikhs in the village. Sparsh's grandfather, along with his family, was hidden in the back of a barn by their Muslim friend Sher Khan, who then sat on the roof of the barn with a gun and said, "If anyone tries to touch you, I'll sort of make sure that they don't." The next morning, Sher Khan's family manages to smuggle Sparsh's family to the Indian border. So anyway, when me and Sparsh arrive back in 2021 in Bela, he's dressed in this kind of outfit that his grandfather says that he used to wear, this old turban tying style that turns out to be like arriving in central London dressed in a kind of top hat, a bowler hat and a walking stick and thinking you're going to fit in. It's kind of 100 years out of date. But we ask around for a man called Sher Khan, who had, looked after a Hindu family during partition. And literally the first person who we meet says, "You're talking about my father. We've grown up on this story of, our family hid all the Hindu families in a barn and we sat on them. And, it turned out we were talking to Sher Khan's son. And so immediately sort of Sparsh starts crying and this man starts crying. And the Sher Khan's son then takes us in for tea, basically offers us a meal and then takes us to the spot in the village where Sparsh's ancestral home used to be and says, this is where your family used to live. We've not built anything on the area since your family left. And it was this incredible moment of homecoming. I'm constantly amazed that despite the political tensions that exist in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, there is still, particularly India and Pakistan, it is unlike any other major conflict zone in the world. Like, you don't have everyone who meets immediately from these countries becoming best friends in Russia and Ukraine or in Israel and Palestine. You just don't have it. Whereas there is this kind of personability between, I think, Indians and Pakistanis, where when people meet in person, there is this immediate want to help out and kind of and so much love that is offered. So Sher Khan's family completely opened up to Sparsh, said, please come stay for a month. We'd love to host you. And when we arrived in his ancestral home, Sparsh just sort of fell to the ground, kissed the ground, and then picked up some pebbles. And he said, my family's story isn't in any archives. We were never that well documented. We weren't in the big cities, and we arrived in Delhi with no evidence of our old life. But he wants to make these pebbles from the old house into jewelry now for his family, so that they can become heirlooms of their sort of pre-partition.
Well, I mean, his story
life.
is now in your book and in this podcast, so it's getting documented slowly but surely. Okay, so the 5 big partitions, right? I guess the best way to do this is chronologically.
Sure.
So we will start with Burma, right?
So,
tell me about the partitions, but also paint I think what's interesting is the evolution of some of the characters. Some of the characters,
sure.
They're only relevant to some partitions. In terms of Gandhi and Nehru, they're central to almost every single one. So just paint the story as you would like.
Sure.
And if you want to have some water before you start, you're most welcome to as well. Besides water breaks, we don't cut out anything besides obviously if you make blah blah blah, we'll cut things out. But generally we just keep it going because we find that the audience, once they're locked in, they lock in.
Sure, amazing. So I'll run down quickly the 5 partitions and then we can go individually.
Awesome, great.
So the 5 partitions that I talk about in the book, first in 1937 you have the separation of Burma. Then between 1937 and 47, you have the gradual separation of the Arabian states, basically a transfer from being ruled from by India to becoming fully fledged sort of protectorates of London, and that's the second one. Then the third one is, of course, 1947, the Great Partition of India and Pakistan along religious lines. The fourth one that I'll get into is the partition of princely India, the fact that some 80% of the modern India-Pakistan border was not drawn by Cyril Radcliffe, but through the decisions of 20-odd princely states whose states happened to be along the border. And that was a completely different process that I think we need to imagine differently. It didn't involve the British with a pen, unlike the previous one. And then, of course, in 1971, the fifth partition occurs in the wake of the cataclysmic War of 1971, which culminates in Bangladesh's independence and the sort of division of the Pakistani state into 2 new nation states, the transformation of the subcontinent for one last time. So to begin with, Burma, which I think I alluded to it a bit earlier, but I think that we've forgotten Burma's central place in the 20th century because of the fact that Burma has vanished from the political map. Very few people read about it these days. But Rangoon was, sort of the boom town of the 1920s. And Burma was the largest and richest province of the Raj. There are so many people migrating in from...
So wealthier than Hyderabad with the wealthy Nizam?
So in terms of sort of average GDP, yes, Hyderabad had this immensely rich aristocracy, but had this immensely poor peasantry at the same time. So that at the same time you have the richest families in the subcontinent's history, but you also have Hyderabad becoming eventually, the seat of one of the first communist revolutions or attempted communist revolutions in South Asia because of how poor many rural bits of the state were. Burma was on average far richer because there was just sort of more farming opportunity. There were richer resources, etc. And Burma had always sort of had huge trade with India. Various Indian sultanates and states had extended into Burma, and there was no obvious divide in the way that we imagine it today. I think it's hard to get our mind through this, although Burma, Burmese languages are quite different from North Indian languages, for example. But much of northeastern India, Nagaland, Manipur, etc., speak Tibeto-Burmese languages. The last Burmese empire stretched as far as Assam in the west. The Bengal Sultanate, meanwhile, once stretched far into modern-day Burma. So there was no, I guess what I'm trying to say is there is no sort of natural border in the way that we often imagine it today, although frequently conceived of as a different unit. Burma is undergoing massive changes in the 20th century, and because so many people are migrating there, you have what I like to compare with a kind of 1920s version of the Brexit debates, where people are saying that in order to, increasingly Burmese speakers are saying in order to get a job, they need to speak either Hindi or Bangla, but they can't get by just speaking Burmese. And increasingly there's a move not to get independence from the British, but to get independence from India, to become a separate colonial unit. But this debate completely slices Burma down the middle, because it's actually rather unpopular amongst many people who believe that Burma is an integral part of the Indian nation. The most popular Burmese politician at the time is this guy called Mahatma Uttama. And he's called the Mahatma after, because of the fact that he emulates Gandhi often. And he brings kind of Gandhian non-violence into Burma. He's the briefly the head of the local Indian National Congress chapter. But I think everything, and interestingly, Gandhi opposes him. Gandhi says, no, we don't want Burma to be part of India because you're not in the Indian epics. But Uttama falls out with Gandhi over this, saying, no, we want to remain part of India because we've been connected to India via trade and culture ever since Buddhism arrived in Burma from India, thousands of years ago. And basically saying that there have always been this sort of immense trade and connections that we want to maintain. I think everything changes in a way that we completely forget with the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash of 1929, because a series of Tamil bankers have basically underwritten the Burmese economy. If you go to South India today, you can visit the area of Chettinad, and you'll see vast, vast, vast palaces built by these bankers, made from Burmese teak. They are the bankers who've underwritten the Burmese economy, and their cuisine often has all these sort of Burmese spices in it. But when the Wall Street, but their model worked on a very simple thing. If you sort of default on your debts, we'll just take your property because that your property is your collateral. And in the course of a couple of years after the Wall Street crash, in about 5 years, this group of Tamil bankers take over 1/4 of Burmese agricultural land. So imagine if after 2008, imagine if between the 2008 financial crash and 2013, a group of bankers from southern India had taken over 1/4 of all farmland in Britain. It's a sort of massive shift that completely turns public opinion in the country. And suddenly, for the very first time, these debates about should we separate from India or not begin to really have public traction. And so on April Fool's Day, 1937, the first partition of the subcontinent carves its way through the subcontinent. There's no immediate refugee crisis, although that does come a few years later, and we can get into that in a second. But you have this kind of growing hostility towards Indian families who've often been living there for something like, 100, 200, 300 years. This pressure to decide who is indigenous and who is not. And in particular, there's this kind of fascist politician who actually has sort of Hitler's approval, and Hitler writes very approvingly of him, called U So, who writes up a list of ethnicities that he believes need to be purged from Burma. These include Bengalis, these include Tamils, these include Punjabis, and crucially, an indigenous group called the Rohingya, who he believes speak a dialect related to Bangla and thus should also be purged from Burma. We forget that when the kind of recent Rohingya genocide happened, it was essentially all harks back to this moment, the first moment that the Rohingya are declared non-indigenous is at this moment in the partition of Burma. And I think that we forget also how massive the consequences were, the ricochets of this event that's been completely forgotten. You don't read about it in Indian textbooks, in Pakistani textbooks, in British textbooks. Researching this, there were about 3 or 4 books ever written on the partition of Burma. Matthew Bowser's one is, I think, the best, and everyone should look at. But once you get into the archives, you see that every single person in the 1940s who begins pushing for the partition of India in 47, the creation of Pakistan, is looking towards Burma as their inspiration. The man who comes up with the word Pakistan, Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, he writes, it makes no sense to me, something along the lines of, it makes no sense to me why, if Burma is allowed to be separated from the Indian Empire, why the Muslims of northwestern India must be forced into a federation with people with whom they share no culture. And so the very first declaration of intent for the creation of Pakistan ever made makes it explicitly clear that Burma is the model. And yet somehow we've forgotten we've written Burma out of the story. We've decided that Burma is part of Southeast Asia, and the rest is South Asia, and so kind of different specialists now look at in different library and different university courses. And I think that today the tragedy is that very few Indians or Pakistanis or Bangladeshis know Burmese history, and very few Burmese students will study South Asian history, despite the fact that these were regions so closely tied together for so long.
Okay, so that's fascinating. What's the reaction? I mean, you've spoken a bit about the reaction and how it kind of inspires what becomes Pakistan, because people refer to what happened in Burma. But what's the sort of the because initially, the Great Depression changes minds in Burma. But in terms of, and I doubt this changed, every day, like villages, how the way villages thought about themselves in India. But in terms of the Indian National Congress, what's their sort of intellectual and political response to this partition, and how does it impact them in any way? I mean, that's meaningful.
I think that the Congress doesn't think too much about it. They are not too concerned with the separation of Burma. I think that the Muslim League, Muslim politicians look onto it because of the fact that so this also occurs the same year as Aden is separated, and you get the beginning of the separation of the Arab states.
Yeah.
And I think that the question of Muslim representation in a future Indian parliament becomes so much more urgent if you've just cut off all of the non-Hindu sections of the Raj. Burma is majority Buddhist, Christian, and animist, and in a sense, it's sort of it gave representation to kind of non-Hindu groups, whereas and likewise in the Arab states, you had mainly Muslim populations, and if you chop off these areas, for the very first time, Hindu political domination over Muslims becomes a real politically charged question. In a way that it just wasn't pre-1937. And I think that if you want to understand why the Pakistan demand grows so quickly, seemingly out of nowhere in the late 1930s, I think you need to look towards events like the partitions of 37, because you just can't understand why it becomes so pressing so quickly otherwise.
And then final question on Burma. I mean, I think it's the final question. There's no massive forced migration like there is in India, Pakistan. But you did mention there was this list of ethnicities with the aim of ethnic cleansing. So there had to be some ethnic cleansing. What is the ethnic cleansing?
So Usul, basically this guy who writes up this list, begins basically trying to orchestrate pogroms against the minorities of Burma who he wants to expunge. And there are two key moments. I can't remember the exact dates, but basically after the separation, I think it's in 1939, you get a massive pogrom of Indians, so that by the time World War II begins, and that you have the Japanese suddenly sweeping in to Southeast Asia, suddenly conquering Indonesia, and that sort of, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, suddenly sweeping across Asia. You have this sort of sudden moment when the British begin evacuating from Burma in 1941. And against this backdrop, many Indian communities begin debating their future. They begin to wonder whether, without the British apparatus essentially protecting them, whether they are going to suffer because of these pogroms. And, there's going to be complete chaos with the Japanese coming in, and who knows what their future is. And so in 1941, 366,000 Indians flee on foot from Burma back to India. Many of them whose families left India 4 generations earlier and had never been there before. Today, you can still see traces of these communities who came back on foot, basically anywhere that you eat khao. So often you have cities like Chennai or Karachi where khao is a massive dish. That is because
khao has made it's made its way to South Africa by the way, through the migration of Indians to South Africa. So yes,
it's a Burmese dish that basically at this moment suddenly becomes popular in Indian cities. But I think that it's often known as the forgotten Long March because it's been overshadowed by the later partition migrations, and so sort of there is no memorial in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Burma to this massive migration. But it was amazing trying to look for, like, I think one of the most rewarding bits of researching this book was finding families who went on that walk. One of whom, for example, my friend Sanveer from North London gets in touch. Sanveer says, my grandfather actually went on this walk, and we recently discovered that he has a diary in the attic that he wrote on the walk. And to my knowledge, it's the only non-English language, kind of British account of this long march. There's this photograph that they had. Again, so many of the sources for this book have been found in random attics that they're not sitting in the British Library. They're not sitting in the Indian archives. They are tucked away in someone's houses. They are the sort of family heirlooms, essentially. But there's this photograph that they have, the last photograph taken of the Sikhs of Bordwin in Shan State, Burma. And they take one last photograph of the whole community before they set off. And the diary reads like this, rather like this kind of Sikh version of Apocalypse Now. The Sikh families rowing their way up the Chindwin River as kind of leopards attack them along en route, and British Spitfires are fighting with kind of Japanese planes overhead. This war is happening around them, and this family is having to kind of head up the river, trying to kind of seek safety back in India without really knowing where to go. And basically, very, very few of them ever make it. They have to burn their entire library. And, for most of the walk, they're able to keep the books from their old Gurdwara, these kind of priceless texts from the kind of 18th century that have been preserved. And then they have to abandon them en route because of the fact that they can't lug them up the hill when the jungles turn to mud and there are leeches. And all of this happens against the backdrop of this, of the largest freak appearance of green butterflies that happens once every 100 years. So there's, hundreds of dead bodies and of refugees littering these jungle pathways covered with green butterflies. And it sort of feels very, very cinematic, this thing. So this diary is now been, is I think being taken up by the British Library. So hopefully next year, any researchers who are interested in the story will actually be able to look at it. It's all written in Gurmukhi, in Punjabi. And it's the most incredible account, first hand, that again was just sitting in an attic, and the survivor of this walk later becomes the first Sikh model for Mosbros, the clothing company, and I think his grandson later kind of worked for the PR of Dishoom, the restaurant. So this history exists everywhere around us. And it makes incredible films. So I know that Sanveer now wants to also make a documentary about his grandfather's story, and fingers crossed it gets made because it's the most incredible story.
You've mentioned World War II, and we're moving now to the partition of the Princely Arab states. It's in a way it's connected, in a way it's not. Tell us about that partition. But and if you want to start talking about how World War II is now going to have a much more significant impact, or to what extent it does, you can weave that into the story as well.
Sure. So the debates that emerge, that begin in Burma, about what is India and who is Indian. Is everyone in the Indian Empire an Indian? Or is it only people who are part of the kind of, the main subcontinent bit, and our Arabs and Burmese actually kind of, just random bits lumped together with the rest of the subcontinent for administrative purposes by the British? Who counts as Indian? And I think that a lot of these questions are questions that that are still debated to this day, unfortunately. But this all begins in Burma, and the debate becomes obsessed with this idea of Bharat Mata, this idea that there is this kind of sacred geographical unity of the subcontinent as set forth in the ancient epics. Now, in response to this, you get the suggestion that as well as separating Burma, maybe the Gulf states and Aden and Yemen should be separated as well. There's this guy called Bernard Riley, a Brit who's in Yemen, who is arguing essentially that that Aden is bogged down by the kind of Indian bureaucracy, and if it was given its own kind of devolved government, it would be far more efficient. There's also several key figures in Yemen who say kind of, why are we, I think there's this guy called Macaulay who starts arguing that, why are my kids all learning about the Mughal emperors and the Marathas and the Sikh Empire, but are learning nothing about Arab history. They're stuck on the Indian curriculum, and that Arabs find it harder to get bank loans in Aden than Indians because of the fact that they're considered less reliable. And so most of the big jobs in the docks are not going to Arabs, etc. So you get the beginnings of a kind of nationalist movement growing in Yemen specifically around the same time. But remember, most of this area is run by princely states. And so rather than, and it's only really in Aden that you have these questions coming up. Everywhere else, it's more to do with, what does the prince decide? In between 1937 and 1947, the British transfer the Arab states from the purview of the viceroy to the colonial office in London. So essentially, when the future Indian nationalists actually begin looking at which princely states they want to integrate into India, these states are missing from the ledger. What's interesting, though, is I found this series of conversations where British bureaucrats were actually negotiating with Indian nationalists in the 1930s and suggesting that basically kind of, the future Indian nation remain in control of the Persian Gulf Residency and the Aden Residency. These two sort of Persian Gulf Residency was based in Bahrain and basically looked after all of the states from Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, and Oman, whereas the Aden Residency basically looked after all of the states that formed part of what's now southern Yemen. And they say, it was with surprising unanimity that India's political leaders said that they had absolutely no interest in running the Gulf states after independence. There was this sense that these were small desert enclaves that would be very expensive for India, which was, considered a very poor country who didn't have the expenditure to basically kind of guard these distant sort of desert oases on the other side of the Arabian Sea. And so Indian nationalist politicians essentially willingly give up control of the entire united GCC states. And there is this kind of this great what if that I talk about in the book of what if that had not broken? What if when Nehru and Sardar Patel are handed the list of princely states, what if Abu Dhabi was still alphabetically the first one? Would India or indeed Pakistan have sort of, annexed these regions and transformed them into a state of India or Pakistan? Probably Pakistan would have inherited these regions because of the fact that they were Muslim majority.
Yes.
And Pakistan would have been a very different entity had it included not just East Pakistan and West Pakistan, but also a South Pakistan, And so history could have looked very, very, very different. But through the kind of roll of a dice, and I think one of the main things that I emphasize in the book is how so many of the greatest, most mythologized moments of national history are essentially the result of sort of these small acts of chance, of hubris, of people making these kind of small little decisions. I think that, the history of the subcontinent could have been very, very, very different indeed.
Okay. It's difficult to. Now when you look at Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Doha, a lot of the laborers who images of them are usually in blue overalls, building lots of buildings, often the more privileged ones are taxi drivers, Uber drivers, people who are waiting in restaurants. Vast majority of them come from Nepal, come from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, various provinces, and are very much so. In many of these countries, their passports are still taken away. They don't have, and it's difficult to imagine how they could have been a flip in power. At the same time, eventually oil is discovered in these nations and they become enormously wealthy. They are now very wealthy states who, have a lot of sway in various ways. You mentioned it's chance and the trick of it. I mean, I don't want to go too much off all of the various partitions we still need to get through. But do you think empire and the nature of empire would have allowed a uniform state? I'm just talking about Pakistan in the sense. Once the partition happens, for like Pakistan then to have access into the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf and all of these states and as far as Kuwait, do you think empire, be it the British Empire or any of the powers post World War II, would have actually allowed that to exist?
Well, I think it when you look at the documents, it's very clear that it was an option that was talked about,
Yes.
but that it didn't move that direction. I don't think that, one needs to talk, of course, about the fact that, had a very populous Pakistan ruled over the much more depopulated Gulf regions, it would have probably erupted into an even sort of worse separatist movement than we saw in East Pakistan, where, there would have been, you would have probably had, the far more populous north basically trying to control the resources of the south. And so, virtually no Emirati scholar or Omani scholar that I've spoken to has ever suggested that this would have ended in anything other than essentially tragedy.
Yes.
And I think that, one can get carried away with these ideas. But I think it's also surprising how much this possibility has been erased and forgotten. So within certain bits of the Gulf, and I think specifically the UAE, a lot of the Indian Ocean history has been sort of highlighted, but the connections with India have been erased because of this, the fact that many Indians come as migrant laborers, etc., and do a lot of racism. The fact that the Gulf was subservient to the Viceroy of India, not to London. It wasn't a protectorate of London. It was a protectorate of the Raj. The fact that the Indian political service basically kind of ran the region, that if you wanted to sue someone sitting in Dubai, you often had to do it in the Bombay High Court. The currency was the rupee. These things, I think, have often been erased. And of course, it is different. They weren't nearly as integrated into the Raj system as, for example, Jaipur or Kashmir. Oman and Nepal were two particular cases where they were considered in the sort of Raj official papers informal princely states. They were both considered to be sort of officially independent, but the entire Raj administration is there anyway. And so kind of like secret. And so a lot of people were often surprised when they arrived in Oman and basically saw the fact that the Indian political services they're using the rupee and all this sort of stuff. So, but I think that to a huge extent, this history is not spoken about. I think it's far more spoken about in Yemen, but Yemen's been in the middle of a civil war, and so people have less interaction with that. But there is a lot of discussion in Yemeni scholarship about these connections with India. Actually, a lot of new research on the Gulfs as the western periphery of the Raj has come recently from Qatar. So there's this scholar in the Qatar Digital Library called James Onley, who I think was basically, is it James? Yeah, who was hired to digitize all historic documents to do with Qatar. There was this sort of assumption that there wasn't that much history in the Gulf pre-oil, and no one had really sort of written that much about it except in a few books here and there. And so he went around different countries, like the British Library, for example, looking for documents that might pertain to Qatar. It turned out that the entire history of Qatar did exist and had been documented by the Raj, but it wasn't sitting in London. Where was it sitting? It was in the Maharashtra State Archives in Mumbai. Because for so long, for almost a century, the kind of Persian Gulf Residency had been sending kind of daily reports back to Bombay. And so all Qatari scholars who want to now study Qatari history now go to the Bombay State Archives in Maharashtra, which I find sort of, which seems incredibly funny until you realize that, Bombay was the big city in the region, and that was where, all the political power from the Gulf was. Some of the best books on the Gulf coming out at the moment are all talking about how, the sea connects rather than divides, how there's far more communication and trade between, Muscat and Dubai and Bombay and Karachi than there were to any of these cities and their kind of, interior peripheries. Yeah. Because, you just needed to hop on a boat and you could be there in a day or two.
Okay. These wealthy Gulf states, which were now formerly, were part of the Raj in the princely states, have thrived to a large extent. I mean, the current war with Iran is an exception to that, but they've kind of thrived. The exception's been Yemen.
Yeah.
What happens in Yemen there's a lot of new things that have happened to Yemen, which have not got to do with the fact that it was partitioned from India, but what parts of it, in terms of it, of the shattering that you talk about, has left Yemen in the state that it's in?
So Yemen's current civil war is of recent origins, but there is this growing sense in the 1960s that basically the Brits are still hanging around. And Aden, which has always been the big city in the region, today it's Dubai, but back then it was Aden. Aden was, on the straits, on the Bab el Mandab, and basically there's a growing revolutionary movement. Ultimately, unlike in the eastern Gulf states, there's a revolution that basically overthrows all of the monarchies and sets up a revolutionary government called the NLF, the government, the kind of communist government of South Yemen, that becomes a hub for revolutionaries across the region. And I think that then, that creates a completely different sort of political situation in the region. Eventually, it will unify with North Yemen, which is an entirely different country that was a former Ottoman principality rather than a former British principality. But I think that the history of Yemen from then has sort of veered onto a very, very different course. But of course, the crucial thing is that there was far less oil in Yemen. But I think that it has from the 1970s, I think there was this growing sense that the rest of the Gulf states were quite different from Yemen because of this, because on one side you have the kind of monarchical states and on the other side you have this kind of revolutionary communist state. And I think that sets them onto very, very different paths. And it also, and it leads to a tragic erasure, I think, also of a lot of the evidence of the kind of old India connections. You can still see it in Aden, though. I mean, Aden, you've still got old Parsi towers of silence. You've got old Gujarati temples. There was a point when kind of Gujarati was one of the most spoken languages in Yemen, in the kind of Yemeni capital of Aden, which is just extraordinary to think. But now, of course, that whole world has vanished. And notably, amongst the major figures who were of modern South Asian history, Dhirubhai Ambani is one who shows up a lot in the book. Dhirubhai Ambani, today, his children run the kind of, one of the largest business empires in Asia today, Reliance. And they make their wealth from so Ambani spends the 50s living in Yemen. He comes from this long line of Gujaratis who had links in Aden, so that when he first visits Aden in the 50s to work in oil, he is he encounters all of his friends from his nearby village, because even as late as the 1950s, you still had such strong links with the kind of Gujarati coast and Yemen. He later moves to Bombay, starts his own business. But when the revolutionaries overthrow the monarchies of sort of South Yemen, and create this new revolutionary state. Later, there's also a series of land seizures, which makes a lot of the South Asian diaspora flee. And Ambani has this very simple policy, which was basically to hire up all of these brilliant businessmen who are leaving Aden and give them a job at Reliance. And so a lot of the first generation of India's most lucrative company come from this kind of generation of brilliant minds trained in sort of Yemeni free market capitalism, as opposed to kind of the Nehruvian socialism that was prevalent in India at the time, and made them much more savvy about global markets and how to kind of transform this business into one of the largest conglomerates the world has ever seen.
Very interesting. We're going to take a break because I think we need to stretch a bit. Yeah, because we're going to get to the big one now. India, Pakistan.
Let's grab some more water.
Get some water. Stretch your legs. Okay, I think now we're moving to the meaty part, the big partition, 1947. Tell us about 1947, its origins, and I think mainly we're probably going to touch on Jinnah, once more Nehru, Gandhi, Sardar Patel, and the RSS. Over to you.
I think that the other two partitions that we just spoke about, 37, 47, in 37, could have been two of the seminal moments of the 20th century, but they've been completely overshadowed by 47 because it remains to this day the largest forced migration in human history. It's the prism through which 1/4 of the world, the subcontinent, continues to perceive its past, present, and future. And it's this kind of event, I think, that's as seminal and important to understanding the 21st century as the world wars, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's one of those kind of central pivots around which the 20th century revolved. It begins, as I mentioned earlier, to do with stories of Muslim representation. In 1940, Muhammad Ali Jinnah sets out his aim to establish independent Muslim states in the subcontinent. Again, it's unclear, and increasing scholarship suggests that he's not at this point searching for a nation state. He's searching for something more akin to the status of Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland within the UK right now, a kind of semi-autonomous region. But things really begin to change, I think, with the end of World War II. By 1945, London's been blitzed. Coventry's been razed to the ground by bombs. The British economy has faltered so badly, and it has been wrecked thanks to the war. And very, very quickly, in late 1945 and early 1946, it becomes clear that all of these questions about Indian independence are gonna arrive now, and that now it's not a question of kind of will India become independent, but when will it, and how many Indias will there be? So there's a series of political settlements, I think, under the penultimate Viceroy Wavell. There's all these discussions held between the Congress and the Muslim League, basically to decide this question once and for all: will there be, one state or two states to emerge from the Raj? What remains of it? And there's this very near moment where they come to resolving everything. It's a moment called the Cabinet Mission Plan, and I think everyone I know who's ever studied partition, this is the moment when everything could have been avoided. Basically, they all agree to 5 states being part of this sort of federated Raj called North India, South India, East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and an independent Deccan. And Jinnah agrees to this. He says, this is exactly what I was seeking. And Congress agrees to this, and they get within a kind of hair's width of resolving everything. But at the last moment, I think it's Gandhi and Nehru basically pull out of this agreement, and it's over this kind of rather minor details. Basically, it's to do with, will the Northwest Frontier, which at this point actually had a Congress government rather than a Muslim League government, will the northwest frontier be part of the kind of North Indian section of this federated system, or will it be part of the West Pakistan? This tiny niggle leaves Jinnah feeling completely betrayed. He pulls out of it and says, no, we're not going to settle for any of this kind of minor nonsense. Instead, we're going to assert our direct action day, a day where Muslims along the subcontinent can demonstrate their power, demonstrate their numbers, and show basically the British that we mean business. This happens in August 1946 and results in this explosion of violence. The local Muslim League leader, Suhrawardi, basically wants to show that he's got more power, and he wants to assert that he should be sort of, ruling East Pakistan. And he makes a series of very incendious comments on stage that ultimately compiles with all this kind of built up tension, and Kolkata explodes into violence. It's the first partition riot. We tend to imagine that riots were a kind of feature of the North Indian landscape, but they weren't to the extent that they would become. And August 1946, violence suddenly begins to stream across the subcontinent. So that, there are retaliatory fights in Noakhali in Bihar, some where Hindus are massacring Muslims, some where Muslims are massacring Hindus. And by March 1947, they've stretched all the way from Bengal and have reached Punjab in the west. And at this point, the Brits send out a man called Mountbatten to be the last viceroy. And his mission is very clear. Decide as quickly as you can whether to hand over power to one or two states, and then make it happen within a year and a half, by June 1948. And I think that we tend not to realise how fast everything subsequently moves, because that June, he announces it for the very first time on the radio that India is going to be partitioned along religious lines into two new states. And India, Hindu majority regions and Sikh majority regions will become India, and Muslim majority regions will become Pakistan. But what I think he then does the next day is he announces that he's going to be moving forward the date of this partition. He says, rather than waiting until June 1948, there is so much violence now that we want to get it done as quickly as possible. So we're going to make our aim to be August 1947. Why? Because it's the second anniversary of the Japanese surrender in World War II. And what happens subsequently is the kind of the worst bureaucratic nightmare that even Kafka could not dream up. Suddenly bureaucrats have 77 days to partition everything from rivers to stationary sets. You have, the famous case where after the dust settled, it emerged that all the government libraries had ended up with A to K of the Encyclopedia Britannica going to India and K to Z all going to Pakistan, because everything had been done in such a rush. You have the fate of the Mohenjo-Daro necklace, this necklace from the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro, this beautiful, on a golden thread from 4,500 years ago. And the stones on it none of them were from the subcontinent. You had lapis from Afghanistan, you had jade from Burma, you had, topaz from ancient Egypt, you had something else from ancient Mesopotamia. It was a story of ancient trade on a single necklace. And unsure of who should get the necklace, the bureaucrats decide to snip this 4,500-year-old necklace in half and gift an equal number of beads to India and an equal number of beads to Pakistan. So kind of, last minute are all the decisions. And crucially, I think there's this amazing image that you can see from the Daily Herald 1 month before partition, and they're theorizing what will the subcontinent actually look like. And they think that the biggest cities of Pakistan are going to be Delhi and Kolkata. And Jinnah is talking about Kolkata is going to be the Pakistani capital.
My God.
Because it's the biggest city of Muslim majority Bengal. And so I think that we need to understand how inconceivable the borders that we actually have turned into these sort of national identities really were. And the rush that this was in. And it's amidst this confusion. It's amidst this mad rush to the finishing line. Indian nationalists have been marching for independence to happen for 40 years, but suddenly it's coming in 77 days. And it's amidst this uncertainty that you begin to get streams of people, proactively moving across these borders that have yet to be drawn to try and make sure that they're in kind of the right country. And you have the beginnings of what will very quickly become the largest forced migration in human history. You also have mass ethnic cleansing and religious cleansing in vast parts of Punjab and Bengal, basically to try and change the demographics of the town. Many people think that there's going to be a census next year, that this is going to happen next year. And so if we can just kill everyone of the other religion, we can change the demographics. At the same time, you also have just, people looking to loot nearby villages and kind of, get some gold or kind of, become rich. And so particularly around Punjab, particularly around Rawalpindi and around Patiala, you see kind of complete descent into chaos. And the man put in charge of drawing the border is a man called Cyril Radcliffe. He's actually suggested by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, because he's thought to be an unbiased arbitrator because of the fact that he's never been east of Paris, and that he therefore won't have any preference of Muslim League or Congress. But of course, choosing a man who's never been east of Paris to determine the fate of a quarter of the world's population has diabolical and deadly consequences. And so last minute is everything that the final border is actually only announced 3 days after independence, so that India and Pakistan are born without knowing which cities they actually govern. The reason that Karachi is where Jinnah celebrated Pakistani independence is because it was the only city that had pre-partition been confirmed to be a part of Pakistan. The only major city. And what you get is Cyril Radcliffe basically saying, this is an impossible task, burning all of his papers after he's done, and fleeing back to the UK, saying that, there are 3 million people who will have issue with him, and he does not want them to find him. And bizarrely, we're sitting here in London today. Bizarrely, his next job after the creation of Pakistan is to reform the BFI, the British Film Institute. So kind of after the creation of Pakistan, that's his next job. And so every time you're in the South Bank now, kind of, that was his creation after Pakistan. It's amazing how much these, sort of imperial legacies can be spotted everywhere that you go. And yeah, so by the time that the border is announced, you have people listening to the radio trying to hear which country that their hometown has become part of. And the border very often is nothing like what people anticipated. For example, Nankana Sahib, the birthplace of Sikhism, ends up in Pakistan. Many Muslim majority regions end up in India. Many Hindu and Sikh majority regions end up in Pakistan. And you have, for example, for reasons to do with water supply, Radcliffe grants Muslim majority Murshidabad to India. And to kind of, make sure that that's all okay, he decides to thus give Pakistan the Chittagong Hill Tracts, which are 90% Buddhist. And so, nothing about the border actually resolves the central question that partition was done to try and prevent, which is, how do we get along with the multi-religious and multi-ethnic populations? And in fact, 40% of Bengal's of Bengal's Hindus will end up in Pakistan, and 40% of the Muslims will end up in India. So it doesn't resolve any of the questions that it was intended to try and prevent in the first place. And it gets so bad, I think, just last little thing, that very quickly the Pakistani government announces that it can't house all of the world's Muslims. And so to try and demand that people do not move to Pakistan, and it begins to try and deport people who move there from outside of Punjab, where Punjab was the only place where it was announced that there would be, the violence had got so bad that there would be an actual transfer of religion populations. all Hindus and Sikhs will be given the option to migrate to India, and all Muslims will be given the option, government sponsored, to move to Pakistan. But everyone else is basically asked not to do so.
Okay. Now we're gonna get into the horrors further. I mean, because you already discussed some of them, some of the horrors of partition. It really is a tragic story. You document a few stories, anecdotes inside the book, which are really horrific. The extent of the violence. It's unrelated to the violence, but I think a good anecdote that explains the legacy of this is you say that it's a myth. In the start of the book, you say it's a myth that the Great Wall of China can be seen from space. But what you can see from space is the border between India and Pakistan, because it's become so militarized, it's become so built up, so concretized, lots of floodlights, all that kind of thing. And so we'll get there later. But before we go there, you speak about this moment where, in 1946, there were these 5 provinces and we were very close to it. And then there's this bureaucratic problem over one particular region and whether that's going to be in a state which would be Pakistan or one of the other Indian states.
The most minor niggle.
So why don't the leaders then? Because Jinnah responds by saying we'll have a Muslim Day of Action. Then Nehru and Gandhi do a bunch of not retaliation, but they then do what they need to do to assert their position. What happens with the leadership? What happens with Jinnah, Gandhi, Nehru, Sardar Patel, other influential figures? What are they doing? Because we talk about Radcliffe and Mountbatten, and obviously they are in charge and they come and I think there becomes an opportunistic moment where they're like, whatever Radcliffe gives us, we'll take, etc. But you had this leadership who've been leading a movement effectively for about 25, 30 years. What did they do wrong in terms of not being able to pull back? And what are the forces that made them agree to this or go along with this instead of being like, hey, just hold on?
Yeah.
What happened?
I think that they'd become so distrustful of each other towards the end, and all of them by this point are becoming very, very paranoid. Everyone's convinced that this sort of tinderbox is about to burst, and it is bursting, and there are massacres on the streets, and they're all holding the other side responsible. And in fact, a lot of new scholarship on the first partition riot, for example, suggests that Congress is certainly convinced that it was basically kind of, the secret plan of the Muslim League all along to sponsor this pogrom. It seems that actually it's tragically more to do with that the first spark was to do with hungry Muslims trying to break into a food bank, because again, the Bengal famine had just been a few months and years earlier. And so the first spark might have been, this new scholarship suggests, that basically these hungry Muslims were trying to break into a Hindu food bank. A bunch of people get the wrong impression, think that this is, a religious riot is emerging, when actually it's just a bunch of people trying to break into a food bank. And that kind of, they all start attacking each other, and that is actually the first spark. But I think that news becomes so polarized. So, the kind of the Urdu and the Hindi papers are reporting completely different things by this point, that it's very quickly, but if you're living in the northwest frontier, Muslim dominated, you're only hearing about massacres of Muslims, and likewise if you're living in Bihar, you're only hearing about massacres of Hindus. And I think that very, very quickly, it's a thing that we can relate to today. The kind of news polarization is not something that needs to be explained in the 21st century, but you see a very dramatic version of this. And so I think that so much, for me, one of the surprises, I think that great man views of history, that kind of, it was just a few characters making all the decisions, is a kind of rather old-fashioned way of looking at history today. But in the case of partition, it really does come down to the disagreements of a small group of men, and they are all men. One wonders, had Sarojini Naidu been in the room, or kind of, or Begum Liaquat, or any of the others, or Fatima Jinnah, maybe things might have been a bit different, But this small group of men had become so mutually distrustful of one another that there was sort of virtually no ability for people to listen and understand their respective anxieties. And I think also there was this sense, misguided, that I think it's Nehru who reflects on it later, that there was this, that everyone was so convinced that the problem was that the British needed to get out as fast as possible, and that the moment that everything was resolved, then everything would calm down. And so they get the British army basically to all leave via Bombay and, sail back to Britain in the middle of the massacres. And this tiny, tiny, tiny group of soldiers called the PBF, the Punjab Boundary Force, who's put in control to kind of, keep the security in this vastly populated area. And they call themselves the PBF, the Poor Bloody Fools, because they have none of the resources and everyone's kind of giving up as far as they're concerned. And I think that Mountbatten's callousness of trying to do everything in 77 days, I think that Jinnah and Gandhi and Nehru's just inability to get down into a room and come up with a constructive view.
Okay, I wanted to ask you a bunch of legacy questions around the partition, but before that, you go through a lot of anecdotes and stories to kind of show you just how horrific partition was. Just off the top of your head, try to paint for our audience an idea of the displacement, the violence, the death, and the great tragedy that this was.
Yeah, I've mentioned a few of the figures, but 10 to 15 million people displaced in a matter of months. 1 to 3 million people never make it across those borders. And I think that the entire ethnic makeup of the subcontinent changes. Karachi was all of the major Sindhi cities, for example, were basically Hindu majority. And in Karachi, it wasn't Hindu majority, but it was, Hindus were the largest community. The countryside was majority Muslim, but, virtually the majority of that Hindu population leaves. There are still Hindus, but very little. Much of the most sacred and most populated sea carriers existed in what's now Pakistan. One, just needs to remember that the two great capitals of the Sikh Empire were Lahore and Peshawar. Meanwhile, Delhi was the capital for 1,000 years of Muslim sultanates, and was I think about 40% Muslim in 1947. You have, I think so often we focus on Punjab because that's where the violence was worse, but you have migration absolutely everywhere, so that states like Tripura in northeast India go from being majority Tripuri speaking to majority Bangla speaking. There's a whole linguistic shift. You have cities whose entire kind of industry was dominated by one community who leaves overnight and the economy of a city collapses. You have I think it's kind of jute growers, where the jute farms are on one side and the jute manufacturers are on the other side of the border, and so that industry collapses. You have tea gardens in northeast India who were giving their supplies to the great port of Chittagong in what's now Bangladesh, but who could suddenly have to travel 21,000 miles to Kolkata over jungle in order to get their produce to market, rather than just 10 kilometers to Chittagong. So I think that we focus on the death toll, but I think that there are myriad ways that partition was experienced. And also I think it's important not to imagine this as proof that Hindus and Muslims can't live alongside one another. I think one of the most enduring things that I've felt throughout my research is that almost every single family that I interviewed about partition talked about their lives being saved by a member of the other community, or wanting to meet their old childhood friends from the other side of the border. Very rarely do you hear stories where neighbours actually turned on neighbours. Far often it was a group from outside the village who wanted to basically kind of do a land grab or something. And so I think the mythologizing of partition as this kind of this proof that kind of everyone turned on everyone, I don't think is necessarily reflects the realities on the ground either. And I think that I heard far more stories like Sparsha's of families who had coexisted for centuries, not always equally. There were different relationships in different parts of the subcontinent, and it's important not to generalize here. In some places, one community was very much treated like absolute sort of nothing. In other areas, there was sort of, massive camaraderie. And again, we're talking about a quarter of the world. But I think that the furies unleashed by partition continued to haunt the politics of the subcontinent can continue to mean that in all of the successor states of the Raj, you now see the persecution of minorities, and I think that that's a direct legacy of the furies unleashed in 1947.
I don't want to. I mean, you make a very good point about not mythologizing all of the tragedy, right? But there are these stories. I used to hear some of the stories, and I come from a Gujarati family in South Africa, and both my parents are like, partition was a big tragedy. You know, I mean, if you speak to Pakistanis, they're like, I think now Pakistanis, Indians have both carried on this mythology where, like, thank God for partition, because we'd have been at constant war, not like there isn't constant conflict anyway. But I mean, I would hear the stories of, you know, train loads of one religious group arriving and or going. I don't want to focus on the myths, but I think we need to mention some of those myths, and which are not myths. Some of them are reality.
I mean, these are all very much.
I mean, you know, just to give our audience a sense of the grave tragedy, and I think it also shows us why now these two countries and so many of the minority groups within these countries are so angry with each other.
The work of Urvashi Batalia, I think, is extraordinary. She talks to women who survived partition, and there are stories of, you know, that are now very famous, of women jumping in wells to try and escape a massacre and crushing each other. There are stories that, you know, the mass sexual violence, and she encounters many women who are still living with basically their captors from 1947. This was the 90s, 50 years later. These women who were kind of basically captured and assaulted are still living with their assaulter. And you have huge, you know, that there is so, sexual violence is so awful that the governments have to set up these organizations to basically kind of try and retrieve women who've been kidnapped. And there are, particularly around areas like Rawalpindi, there are some of the worst massacres that ever been recorded. I think it's suffice to say that when Margaret Bourke White arrives in Kolkata after Direct Action Day, she's just been photographing the concentration camps of Poland, and describes Kolkata as a site that looks like Buchenwald, one of the you know, worst concentration camps that she'd visited. So, you know, I think that says it all.
Okay. It's a weird question, right? But what do you think that whole region would look like if we ended up with 5 provinces that were part of a bigger country and not what has become 3 separate countries with big, thick borders?
Yeah, I think that some sort of you know, it's impossible to know, but I think that some sort of federated system that recognized individual regional rights and the internal diversity of the subcontinent. I think some sort of, you know, what's amazing is that Nehru, I think that would have been great. Nehru, Aung San, and Jinnah, Aung San being the leader of Burma in 1947, all separately talk about a united states of South Asia in the not too very long future. Jinnah famously didn't sell his house in Bombay because he thought he was going to retire there. Everyone thought that the violence and ruptures of 1947 were going to be temporary. And there are these sort of, you know, incredible moments as late as sort of, you know, the early 1950s, where there are these movements to try and bring these countries back together. Tragically, that doesn't end up being the case. And today, as you mentioned, the border is more visible from space than the Great Wall of China. But I think that this dream of a kind of EU-like system where, you know, somehow there can be freedom of movement whilst understanding that, you know, some sort of, you know, grand single state is never going to be possible. You know, these are ultimately real national identities that have developed in the course of the 20th and 21st century, and that you can't just wish the past away. But I think that we can certainly hope for a situation that's a lot better than we have now, you know. And I think that
we need to discuss the 2 other shatterings, right? And I mean, I think my question is going to lead into them, but what happens in the 50s and 60s that makes this pullback to a federation or to some united, like a EU kind of thing for the subcontinent, impossible? Because I think that eventually leads us to shattering 4 and shattering 5.
Yeah, so I think that There's this fascinating moment that's been documented and retraced thanks to all these declassified files found by scholars like Avinash Paliwal and Pallavi Iyer, who have found basically that, there's this moment in the 50s where RAW and the ISI, or their equivalents in the 50s, are talking about basically intelligence sharing and trying to work together and trying to move past the past and basically trying to stop communist revolutions in South Asia together. And so there's this kind of brief little operation in Rangoon where they're working together that feels like a kind of Bollywood movie. The key thing that changes in the 1960s is that India goes and annexes Goa, which was a Portuguese colony. And India sees this as liberating a lost province of India, but Pakistan sees this as kind of annexing a neighboring country and an imperial aggression, and begins to worry that India wants to go around reclaiming lost areas, and so is going to attack it. So Pakistan begins funding separatists in India. And India very quickly finds out and begins funding separatists in Pakistan. And it all explodes specifically around a former princely state, which is Kashmir. The princely partition, which we've not got into, I'll just try to briefly sum it up. When Cyril Radcliffe had divided the subcontinent, he basically does draw the borders of modern Bangladesh, which I think we should be calling the Radcliffe line rather than the Western one, because his pen doesn't actually touch most of the India-Pakistan borders. He only divides British India, the 2/3 of the subcontinent that were ruled directly by the British. He doesn't touch the protectorates and princely states and sort of protected states and all of these sort of autonomous regions. And indeed, all the princes are given the opportunity to join India or Pakistan. Now, the national narrative that you will hear in these countries is that the Hindu states joined India and that the Muslim states joined Pakistan. And then there were a few, like Kashmir, that proved difficult. What I found fascinating was virtually none of the border states made their decisions along the basis of religion. There's the states of what's now Meghalaya, for example, in northeast India, which was Buddhist and Christian and animist majority, had neither Hindus nor Muslims, and so made their decisions based off of economy. And most of Meghalaya, now in India, decided to join Pakistan. But their accession gets lost in the post. And so eventually, after a month of waiting, they send an accession to India instead. And that is how a whole modern Indian state is part of India rather than Pakistan. So much of this is down to chance moments like this. Jodhpur, the blue city, and Jaisalmer, the kind of desert cities of Rajasthan, are in very long discussions with Jinnah about joining Pakistan, while Bhavalpur and Khairpur are in discussions with Nehru to join India. So none of the western border was essentially determined even after Independence Day. And many of these princely states actually celebrated their own Independence Days. Hyderabad, for example, tries to go independent for another year more. And it's through a few key figures like Sardar Patel in India and Liaquat Ali Khan in Pakistan that gradually these states are pressured into joining either India or Pakistan, or indeed Burma. There are three key states that create major modern sort of conflicts. One is Hyderabad, which tries to go independent. It's got a Muslim nizam, but it's got a Hindu majority population. And it's massively feudal. It's got some of the richest people in the world and some of the poorest. And it sees the first communist rebellion in India, the Telangana armed struggle. To put down the communists, the Nizam leans increasingly on a kind of Islamist paramilitary group called the Razakars, who, as well as targeting communists, also target random Hindu temples. And this leads to a kind of massive civil war, and eventually the Indian army just rolls their tanks in because they don't want this kind of civil war happening in their heart. The Indian army would call it the police action, but it was actually an army action. And in the entire year surrounding the Hyderabad struggle, there is 3 times more displacement around the borders of Hyderabad state than there would be in the Palestinian Nakba the same year, which gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, and yet it's largely, again, falls out of the history books. In Balochistan, there was essentially a constitutional monarchy, the Khan of Kalat and his parliament. And he puts the question of should we join Pakistan or Iran or remain independent to his parliament. The parliament says let's remain independent. But later, through a series of events that I talk about in the book, the Khan is pressured into joining Pakistan. And the modern separatist movement that we see to this day essentially originates, although there's several layers of later conflict, but originates over the question of, did the Khan have the right to make that decision, even though his parliament had rejected it? And the whole struggle in Balochistan to this day originates from this rather simple question that I don't think is discussed enough. And the central sore, of course, in the whole region is the conflict in Kashmir. Kashmir, Muslim majority state, but with vast Hindu populations and Buddhist populations and Sikh populations. One of the most diverse in the entire region, stretching from the plains of Jammu near Punjab all the way up to K2, the second highest point on planet Earth. And included, I think we often forget how big the state was. It's the regions that now constitute Jammu and Kashmir in India, Ladakh in India, on the Indian side, Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir on the Pakistani side of the line of control. And I think what happens is initially the Maharaja of Kashmir, Hindu Maharaja, wants Kashmir to be independent. He says he wants to transform it into the Switzerland of the East. But what happens is one of these massacres that are sweeping through Punjab at this time crosses the border of Jammu and leads to a massacre of Muslims in the southern capital of the state. Now, in response to this, a series of Pakistani military officers go behind Jinnah's back and sponsor what's called the Lashkar, which is basically a kind of a tribal army to go in and try and annex Kashmir to Pakistan by force and try to kickstart a revolution against the Maharaja. But this goes horribly wrong because the Maharaja, in response to the Lashkar, sends in a letter of accession to India to basically help bring in the army. Very quickly, after a matter of months, you have the Indian and Pakistani armies clashing essentially on the kind of Tibetan plateau and sort of near the Kargil border today. And so often this story gets kind of pulled into these national narratives, but I think one of the tragedies of this first war between India and Pakistan is fought by soldiers who'd been risking their lives for one another a year earlier in World War II. And there are these stories that I uncovered in the archives and letters which make it clear that there was this understanding on the front line that if you lobbed a packet of cigarettes across the front line, they would contain letters from friends who were on the other side of the line, but were inquiring to see if their friends were still alive, even though they'd been ordered by their new one-year-old governments to fire at one another's. And I think the human element of friend turning on friend, and of course today, by 1949, the line of control would be established. There would be a ceasefire, and that has sort of informally partitioned Kashmir in two. And today, of course, both India and Pakistan continues to claim Kashmir. There has never been a plebiscite over its future or anything like that. And the Kashmiris continue to get caught between India and Pakistan in war after war after war that I think by the 1960s has begun to poison this kind of narrow moment of moving past partition, moving into a new future together as kind of sister nations, as kind of estranged twins, if you like. But I think in the coming decades, and particularly from the 90s, it's the conflict over Kashmir, which means that basically there is no possibility of sort of friendship between these nations anymore.
Okay. I mean, it's fascinating, and it's not surprising, but there's so much of this which is reflective and reminds me of what's happened to the Arab world as well. Mm-hmm. These borders and how identities and imposed nationalities and imposed identities to a large extent has created so much conflict and so much distrust and so much paranoia and I guess it shattered so many lands. Bangladesh, right? It was once East Pakistan. Brutal war, fought in 1971. Lots of atrocities committed mainly by West Pakistan forces. Where does the idea for independent Bangladesh come from? How does it eventually end up that way? And what is its legacy been?
Sure. We forget that the land that is now Bangladesh was actually the center of the Pakistan movement. Dhaka is where the Muslim League was basically founded. And in 1946, in the kind of the big Pakistan election, if you will, it was the only state to vote in a full Muslim League government. And so, the only state to secede from Pakistan was the only state that actually voted for partition for Pakistan in the first place. And I think that there's this fascinating sort of forgotten history of the 1950s. Pakistan, Bengalis will very quickly get disillusioned with the idea of Pakistan because the Urdu language is declared to be the only language of Pakistan. Bengalis are actually the majority population of Pakistan, and Bengali language is the most spoken language in Pakistan. And so this is...
Why? I mean, how could such a big, silly cultural and bureaucratical error be made?
Jinnah saw Urdu as the historic language of Muslim literature, and given that it was the language essentially of northern India and not of West Pakistan or East Pakistan, he thought it would be a neutral language that could tie them all together, rather than picking Punjabi.
So he wanted to choose one language to unite one nation.
Yes.
Okay.
But of course, with 53 or something % of the population speaking Bangla, Bengalis don't understand why it can't have a system like India, which, of course, creates linguistic states, has multiple state languages, and recognizes all of them as national languages. And so there's very gradually you get disillusionment with the project of Pakistan. But I think throughout most of the 1950s, there's more hope in the project than we tend to imagine today. I don't think it was inevitable that Pakistan broke up in the way that it did in 1971. Because, of the first 8 Pakistani prime ministers, 4 of them are of Bengali extraction. So in the first decade, you have this kind of, rough equality between East and West. What changes is the military coup. Because with the with the military takeover of Pakistan, at that time, only 2% of the army is Bengali. And so essentially the entirety of East Pakistan is pushed out of governance. And suddenly you very, very quickly begin to hear in the 1960s, it feels like colonialism never ended. All of the decisions are made in barracks in Islamabad and Rawalpindi and Karachi, and we have no say in our own future. Once again, we are being ruled from overseas. And this discontent, I think, begins to percolate around a man called Mujibur Rahman. Mujib was once a staunch Pakistani nationalist. He led marches in Kolkata during Direct Action Day, etc. And he features in my telling of Direct Action Day. But by the 1960s, he's completely disillusioned. There's a moment that he seems to basically get in contact with Indian intelligence about fomenting some sort of rebellion against Pakistani authority. It's unclear what exactly happened. A lot of new declassified files in the last 5 years have shed a lot of light on this, and I talk about that in the book too. But essentially, he eventually decides that he wants to become the ruler of all of Pakistan. He stands for election when the military kind of rule ends in 1970, and eventually basically wins the election. A majority of Pakistan's population vote for his party, the Awami League. But the generals, knowing his that he once made contact with an Indian intelligence officer in the early 60s, refuses to hand over power, and instead basically just sends in the tanks. And Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, when he's leaving Dhaka, says the army has saved Pakistan, because he's convinced that by putting down Mujib's movement, he will save the unity of Pakistan. But what the army does is that they roll into the city, round up Mujib, just simply shoot many of his Awami League compatriots. There's an entire brigade of the Pakistan army, which was Bengali, the Bengali brigade, which is basically murdered by the Punjabis in the room with the flick of an officer's fingers. And all of this sort of bloodshed unfolds. There's a massacre of pro-Awami League students in Dhaka University. And this army crackdown that was intended to save Pakistan ends up triggering the largest rebellion against sort of, post-colonial authority in South Asia. So that, and of course, India very quickly makes contact with the rebels and begins funding them. And although for the first few months, the Mukti Bahini, as they're known, is very much basically manages to form its own army, its own sort of internal political system, receives training and arms from India, and gradually India thus gets pulled into the conflict. We don't know the death toll of this war. Mujib would later claim 3 million Bengalis were killed in the year 1971, but he seems to pick the number out of thin air. Pakistani authorities would later claim something more like 30,000 were killed, which also they seem to pick out of thin air. What we do know is that the UN registers, in the year of 1971, the UN registers 10 million refugees crossing into either India or Burma from Bangladesh, which means that by December 1971, 1 in 12 Pakistani civilians has become a refugee. And that is comparable with the scale of displacement in the entirety of the year 1947. And so it's impossible to ever know the death toll, but I think that we need to we need to place 1971 alongside 47 as the central event of 20th century South Asia and the one that completely changed the map of the world. It also culminates, I think, in this forgotten redux of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Pakistan at this time is allied with the United States. The US wants to use Pakistan to open up a diplomatic channel with China and help end the Vietnam War. And so the US gives military assurances to Pakistan's governments. At the same time, India begins getting closer in response to the USSR. And in December, when all-out war breaks out between India and Pakistan over India's funding, basically, of the Mukti Bahini, and as India gets pulled into this war, the US sends in the nukes. The US sends in the USS Enterprise nuclear carrier that had last been seen in the Bay of Pigs in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in response to this, the USSR sends in the nuclear submarines. And so in a way that we've kind of completely forgotten, this nuclear armada begins descending into the Bay of Bengal, ready at a moment's notice to get involved. But of course, basically, the Indian army, hearing about this, decides to make a last-ditch just run for it. Basically, a kind of zoom to Dhaka as quickly as possible and try and end the war this week. They can't, let this war drag on because there's a nuclear armada coming. And they do it. And there's this kind of dash across the Meghna River. The Indian army rolls into Dhaka, and an Eastern Command of Pakistan basically surrenders in the Racecourse Road in mid-December 1971. And with the pen, there's a famous photograph of the Pakistani officer surrendering and basically with his pen signing into existence Bangladesh's an independent Bangladesh as the 12th nation state to emerge from what had once been one Indian empire 5 decades earlier.
Sam, it's been very long and very interesting. I'm not yet done. Just a few more, just rounding up questions. You've researched a lot and traveled a lot to understand this book. Obviously, you grew up in Delhi. I haven't mentioned it yet, but you are the son of another famous historian, William Dalrymple, who probably is known by most of our audience. You learned many things while researching this book. Which things stand out for you? I mean, outside of Jinnah's antics.
I think the thing that surprised me is so often you hear about particularly 1947 as being a kind of civilizational conflict. So many of these countries have projected their kind of 20th century borders back into the distant past as some sort of civilizational rupture. And almost all of these borders were the creations of chance and rolls of dice of history. I think that there was nothing inevitable about the map that we see of South Asia in the 21st century. And I think that there has been this sort of memory loss, the sense of forgetting the ties that once tied us all together. You can see it often in food and stories. I mean, growing up in Delhi, I mean, it's difficult to go anywhere without, one of your friends saying something about, their pre-partition family, or kind of, it's a story that's ever present. It sort of lingers in the background of conversations. It exists in the food that families cook, like famous dishes like butter chicken that were invented in the partition refugee camps. The fact that tandoors were basically unknown in Delhi until partition, when they kind of came over from Punjab. And I think that the furies of 47 and the other partitions grow louder. I don't need to remind the audience that, just last year, India and Pakistan were firing missiles over their border, arguably the closest. It's easy to forget because so much has happened in the last sort of, year and a half. But it was the closest we've come to kind of, all-out war between nuclear-armed powers in the 21st century. And that was just a year and a half ago. So the furies are alive, they're real. And I think that there has still been no, what do they call it in South Africa, the peace and reconciliation attempt to try and understand what's happened. Instead, there are more and more kind of active attempts to kind of distort the part and vilify the other side, and little attempt to understand this history. I mean, I think that there is no place as well that has more amnesia of this than Britain itself. Britain, which is right at the center of events, at least the first 4 partitions of the book. So often here in Britain, we talk about, Britain's international population, multi-ethnic population as being something that somehow arrives with the Windrush, as opposed to something that arrived because Britain ruled over a quarter of the world for many centuries. And I think that it shouldn't come as a surprise that the South Asian population that lives in Britain today is not reflective of the subcontinent as a whole. There are very few Odia speakers or Telugu speakers or Malayalam speakers in the UK. What we have here are Punjabis and Gujaratis, Bengalis, Kashmiris. And Sindhis. It's precisely those communities who were displaced in 47 and who, when Britain basically kind of, needs rebuilding after the Second World War, have already lost their homes and so decide to journey out into the unknown and rebuild their homes and make a new one. So I think that this is an absolutely central story to modern Britain as well. And it's a story that in so many of the sources that I found was sitting in random private houses across Somerset or kind of, the Highlands of Scotland. The old Mountbatten estate is just 2 hours away in Romsey. And yet somehow until recently, this stuff was basically absent from curriculums. I think, there's far more of a push. When we began Project Dastaan in 2018, there was still basically no Key Stage 3 books that mentioned empire. That is just not the case anymore. And there are now actually, I think, groups like the Partition Education Group have done a wonderful job at lobbying for more, for a greater presence of partition in the national curriculum. There are, wonderful new museum exhibits and things that talk about these things. But, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think that this amnesia around this history is enormous.
Two reflections before I ask you the last question. It's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It came to me as you were speaking. You spoke about how in Britain you have Punjabis and Gujaratis and Kashmiris. It's in South Africa we have 2 Indian communities that are there for a long time. There's a lot of recent arrivals, but it's the Tamil community that came because of indentured labor from Tamil Nadu, brought literally as indentured laborers, slaves by the British, and then the Gujaratis who. It's really occurred to me in the last 3 days, because I knew that the Gujaratis were traders and they came as often as sometimes as wealthy families, often just as, sending a 15-year-old kid to start trade or be an apprentice, and then he slowly brings over his family. This was in about 1910, but they leaving were not just leaving to a part of the British Empire, they were part of this bigger circle and sea of Gujaratis going to Yemen and, going to the Gulf and going to a bunch of places and parts of Africa like Kenya and also to South Africa. Those are the two reflections. Final question. Why did you write the book?
I think I grew up in Delhi in the early 2000s, and against the backdrop of the Mumbai attacks, that moment that kind of, the situation got very bad between India and Pakistan, and sort of, we suddenly had bomb and terrorist drills alongside kind of fire drills at schools suddenly in the wake of the Mumbai attacks. And so when I first went to Pakistan and visited Lahore aged 19, I was completely shocked by how I'd never felt like I knew a city more. Lahore is more similar to Delhi than Delhi is to Jaipur or Lucknow. They are sort of sister cities in any way, and you can drop someone in an area of Lahore and feel, like we're now in the equivalent of Khan Market, we're in the equivalent of Mehrauli, we're in the equivalent of Shalimar Bagh. This is the big Mughal tomb, just like Humayun's tomb, Jahangir's tomb, whatever it might be. And I think that the cognitive dissonance of being in a place that is visually, culturally, socially, absolutely in every way identical, and yet is supposedly the kind of antithesis of home, was just something that I've never really been able to resolve in my mind. It's a complete puzzle. And so I'd begun working on Project Dastaan and collecting oral histories, realizing how sort of all pervasive it was, but also learning that my own grandfather had been out there. He shows up in the book as well. But that discovering the day before his funeral, my grandfather, despite my family living out in Delhi for the last 30 years, since the 80s, never came to visit us. And we could never understand why. He was always sort of, a wonderful, caring father and grandfather to his family, but he never came to visit us. And it was the day before his funeral that we discovered that, as a kind of post-World War II young kid in the army, aged 18, he'd been out in India and he'd put all of his friends onto a train on one side of the border, and none of them had made it onto the other side. And so even discovering that I had this own personal connection, I think through Project Dastaan, I grew more interested in what partition looked like from like if you moved away from Delhi, the fact that this was a pan-continental event. And it was during one of our interviews that I went to Northeast India. I went to Tripura and asked how, I mentioned earlier, Tripura saw a complete linguistic shift because of the number of refugees who migrated into Tripura. So I asked someone about partition and its effects on Tripura. And this academic from Tripura told me, which one? Are you talking about 37, 47, or 71? Because, of course, from the perspective of Northeast India, the first major partition had been the carving off of Burma and the creation of a border to the east. Then suddenly in 47, a new border had shown up on the west. And then in 71, there had been yet another refugee crisis sort of entering Tripura. And I think that way of framing it had blown me away. Later, I then read this book by James Onley, The Arabian Frontier of the Raj, that talked about how the protectorates of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc., had been treated identically to the princely states, and that what you hear about in the Gulf today about no, we were always sort of semi-independent. That was the case of a third of the subcontinent. All of Jaipur was also semi-independent and had also internal ability to make its rules. And I think that this sense that I had that was growing of there's so much that's been forgotten. These national identities have crystallized so much today that we've forgotten the ties that connect us. And I think that if there's one aim I have with the book, it's to remind us that none of this is inevitable. None of this is civilizational. There is no inevitability to the animosities that we see today, and that for far more of history, people have coexisted side by side, and that there have been far more, and that the world is far more diverse than we think, and there have been communities who've traded across these regions for generations, lived in different areas. And I think that, that sense of wanting to remind us what we have in common is the aim of the book.
Sam Dalrymple, thank you so much for your time.